We have bones popping, joints ripping, tendons coming undone. Individuals who, even after they're released from torture, they never walk the same way again. This is a means of torture that is permanently damaging to the people that it is inflicted on.
The Ottoman Empire's history is a fascinating mix of incredible power, rich culture, and, at times, shocking brutality. One of the most chilling aspects of its rule was its harsh punishment methods, designed to penalize wrongdoers and strike fear into others. While they may seem terrifying today, such punishments were common in past empires. From gruesome executions to severe public humiliations, these methods reveal the brutal side of Ottoman justice. Join us as we uncover some of the most terrifying punishments used in the empire and the dark reality behind them. Number 15. Eye gouging. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a brutal warning, a message carved into the minds of everyone watching. In many societies, only the most despised criminals, traitors, rebels, and enemies of the state were condemned to this gruesome fate. The message was painfully clear. Take away a person's sight, and they are stripped of everything, their freedom, their power, even their very connection to the world. Evliya Çelebi, the famous Ottoman traveler and historian, recorded these horrifying spectacles in vivid detail. They didn't happen in secret. They were staged in the heart of bustling cities, right in the middle of crowded public squares. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about terrifying the innocent. The condemned, bound and helpless, could do nothing but wait as a sharp blade, sometimes a dagger, other times a searing hot piece of metal, was driven into their eyes, silencing their screams with sheer agony. But the suffering didn't end when the act was over. That was only the beginning. Blindness wasn't just a physical torment, it was a life sentence of misery. Without sight, a person was thrown into a world of permanent darkness, forced to depend on others for survival. In many cultures, blindness carried an even greater weight, symbolizing disgrace, weakness, or even divine punishment. For some, it was worse than death itself. And that's exactly why rulers used it. It wasn't just about hurting one person. It was about making sure everyone else got the message loud and clear. Defy the ruler, and the person will face a fate even crueler than death. Number 14. Beheadings. Beheadings were one of the most common and feared forms of execution in the Ottoman Empire. They weren't just about punishment, they were a powerful statement. The empire used them to deal with serious crimes, especially anything seen as a threat to the state or betrayal of the Sultan. Unlike drawn-out executions in some cultures, Ottoman beheadings were quick and efficient, carried out with a single strike of a sword or axe. These executions weren't hidden away. They were public events, drawing huge crowds. The spectacle wasn't just about justice, it was a warning. Watching a high-profile figure lose their head reminded people of the consequences of disobedience and reinforced the Sultan's absolute control. One of the most famous beheadings in Ottoman history was that of Sheikh Bedreddin in the 14th century. A respected judge and mystic, he led a rebellion against Sultan Mehmed I, rallying peasants and dissatisfied citizens with promises of economic and social reform. His movement quickly grew, but the Ottomans saw it as a direct challenge to their rule. Once defeated, Bedreddin was captured and, despite his status, sentenced to death. His beheading in Serez was a public event meant to crush any future resistance. On the battlefield, the Ottomans took this brutal practice even further. After defeating an enemy, they often beheaded captured leaders or soldiers, displaying their severed heads as trophies. Some were sent back to the capital as proof of victory, a chilling message meant to demoralize opponents and showcase the empire's military dominance. In the Ottoman world, power wasn't just held, it was displayed in the most dramatic way possible. Number 13. Rhinotomy. Throughout history, cutting off noses, or other facial features like ears and lips, was a brutal and deeply symbolic form of punishment used by many civilizations. This wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was a permanent and highly visible mark of disgrace, meant to strip a person of both dignity and identity. Since the nose is one of the most defining features of a face, its removal would not only disfigure someone, but also serve as a lifelong reminder of their crime. This practice, known as Rhinotomy, was especially common in the Byzantine and Ottoman empires. Many emperors and noblemen met this fate, including Justinian II, whose nose was cut off in 695 AD when he was overthrown. When it came to personal and moral offenses, the rules were even harsher, especially for women. If a woman was caught being unfaithful, she often faced far worse consequences than a man. While a man might get away with flogging, a woman could have her nose cut off as a brutal form of social punishment. To make things even more horrifying, her husband was sometimes forced to carry out the act himself. Imagine the emotional devastation. First, he discovers her betrayal, and then he's ordered to disfigure the very person he once loved. It was a cruel system that punished not only the guilty party, but also those around them. This form of mutilation wasn't limited to adultery. In deeply religious societies where interfaith relationships were considered taboo, Rhinotomy was used as a means of enforcing social and religious boundaries. Number 12. Galley labor. During the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire turned to galley labor to fill the growing demand for manpower in its navy and massive city construction projects. But this wasn't just a system of punishment, it was a way to maintain control over society while also fueling imperial ambitions. Instead of relying solely on professional sailors or enslaved rowers, the Ottomans sentenced criminals to grueling, backbreaking labor aboard their warships. And the list of crimes that could land someone in this brutal existence was shockingly broad. Petty thieves, forgers, and drunkards could find themselves chained to an oar alongside murderers, political prisoners, and even those accused of atheism, an offense seen as dangerous to the state's religious order. Sentences were never less than a year, but on average, convicts served around 8 years. However, in reality, many never made it out alive. The conditions on Ottoman galleys were brutal. Rowers were shackled to their benches, often sitting in their filth for months on end. They endured extreme heat in summer and freezing temperatures in winter, surviving on a diet of moldy biscuits, hard bread, and whatever meager rations the captain deemed necessary. Disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion were rampant, and the punishments for slowing down or disobeying orders were swift and merciless, often involving whips or even death. Even worse, the system had a cruel loophole. If the imperial or local fleets were short on rowers, officials could override standard sentences, meaning that even those sentenced to execution or long-term imprisonment could be thrown onto a galley instead. In some cases, death row inmates were spared the executioner's blade, only to be worked to the bone at sea. Number 11. Emasculation. In the Ottoman Empire, emasculation, the removal of a man's genitals, was among the most extreme and humiliating punishments, reserved primarily for political enemies, criminals, and slaves. It wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was a calculated act designed to erase a man's identity, power, and future. In a society where masculinity was directly tied to authority, wealth, and the ability to produce heirs, being emasculated was considered a fate worse than death. This brutal practice was often used as political retribution, particularly against those who posed a threat to the ruling elite. High-ranking officials, rival claimants to the throne, and even military commanders could suffer this punishment to ensure they could never build a legacy or reclaim power. For slaves, particularly those captured in war, emasculation was a way to render them non-threatening while still allowing them to serve in high-status positions, such as within the imperial palace. Many eunuchs were forced into service in the Ottoman court, where they became part of an elite and highly controlled social class. Some of the most powerful figures in the empire, such as the chief black eunuch, who oversaw the sultan's harem, were themselves castrated men. Ironically, while emasculation was meant to strip men of their influence, some eunuchs wielded significant power, acting as intermediaries between the ruler and the outside world. Beyond the physical agony, the psychological toll was devastating. Emasculated men were not just robbed of their ability to procreate, they were stripped of their social identity. In a culture that placed immense value on lineage and family honor, losing one's ability to father children meant losing one's place in the world entirely. Number 10. Kurbash. The Kurbash was a fearsome whip, about a yard long, traditionally made from the tough, dried leather of a hippopotamus or rhinoceros. Unlike ordinary whips, the Kurbash was a symbol of state power, designed for punishment, coercion, and control. Its use was widespread, particularly in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, where it became infamous for its brutal effectiveness. Authorities didn't just use the Kurbash to discipline criminals. It was a multi-purpose instrument of oppression. Officials wielded it to extract confessions, enforce tax collection, and keep laborers in line. In many cases, it was used to impose corvée labor, a system where peasants were forced to work on state projects such as irrigation canals, roads, and monumental buildings, without pay. If they resisted, the whip came down hard. The fellahin, a term for peasant laborers in regions like Egypt and Sudan, were among its most frequent victims. These workers often toiled under extreme conditions, and supervisors or foremen would use the Kurbash liberally to maintain discipline. The sheer force of the whip was horrifying. Its thick, dry leather could strip skin away in sheets, leaving deep wounds that could become infected in the hot, unsanitary environments where laborers worked. In the hands of a skilled enforcer, it could fracture bones, raise severe blisters, and even cause internal injuries from repeated strikes. Victims of severe lashings were sometimes left permanently disabled. What made this practice even more chilling was that it wasn't just an abuse of power, it was completely legal. The 1830 penal codes, which governed crime and punishment in many parts of the Ottoman Empire, explicitly codified the use of the Kurbash. Number 9. Flayed. Flaying someone alive was one of the most brutal and terrifying methods of execution used across different civilizations for centuries. From ancient Rome to medieval England and the Ottoman Empire, this gruesome practice was designed not just to kill, but to inflict unimaginable suffering. It all started with the victim being stripped of their clothing and tied up, wrists and ankles bound, often left suspended to prevent any resistance. The executioners always began with the scalp and head since that area was incredibly sensitive, ensuring the person remained conscious for as long as possible. Then, with precise and deliberate cuts, they would slice down the body, following the natural lines of the torso, legs, and buttocks. The goal was to remove the skin in large, intact sections, a horrifying skill that some executioners mastered. In some cases, parts of the body were even boiled beforehand to soften the flesh, making it easier to peel away. That added another layer of agony, essentially turning the process into a two-in-one torture method. But here's the disturbing part. Flaying itself wasn't what killed the victim. Instead, death came slowly, sometimes over hours or even days. The body would eventually give out from extreme shock, massive blood and fluid loss, or deadly infections. Some victims even succumbed to hypothermia if they survived long enough. And the horror didn't end with death. Once the person finally passed, their body was often put on display, either nailed to stakes or left hanging as a gruesome warning to others. In some cases, their flayed skin was discarded, but sometimes it was hung right alongside the corpse. Number 8. Hanging. In the Ottoman Empire, hanging was one of the most widely used methods of execution, particularly for serious crimes like murder, theft, and rebellion. However, these executions were not just about punishment. They were carefully staged public spectacles designed to instill fear and maintain order. Hangings typically took place in bustling marketplaces, city squares, or near prominent gates, ensuring that as many people as possible witnessed the gruesome fate of criminals. The body of the condemned was often left hanging for extended periods, serving as a chilling reminder of the consequences of defying Ottoman law. The empire also employed particularly brutal variations of hanging to maximize suffering and deterrence. One such method involved suspending the condemned from hooks impaled through their ribs or shoulders, prolonging their agony before death. Another involved the use of short drop hanging, which caused a slow and painful strangulation rather than an instant death. These gruesome executions were sometimes accompanied by public readings of the crimes committed, ensuring that the message of obedience to the Sultan's rule was crystal clear. The Ottoman authorities understood the psychological impact of public executions. By turning them into theatrical events, they reinforced their absolute power, discouraging potential criminals and rebels. At times, these executions were even timed to coincide with major religious or political events, further emphasizing the empire's strict control over its subjects. Some of the most infamous hanging sites included Constantinople's Beyazıt Square and the walls of the Grand Bazaar, locations where both locals and foreign travelers bore witness to the brutal enforcement of Ottoman justice. Number 7. Life or death race. This strange tradition started in the 18th century and stuck around well into the 19th. It was a high-stakes game that applied only to the viziers of the Ottoman Sultan, powerful officials who, for one reason or another, found themselves on the wrong side of the ruler. Sometimes they had committed a crime, but often they were simply out of favor. Either way, when their time was up, they got a rather nerve-wracking summons. The execution process began with a seemingly polite meeting with the head gardener. But this wasn't just any gardener. He was also the official executioner of the Ottoman Empire. After exchanging formal greetings, the vizier would be handed a cup of sherbet. If the drink was white, he was safe. But if it was red, well, that meant his execution was imminent. The color red, symbolizing blood, was all the warning he needed. At that moment, the vizier had one shot at survival, running for his life. The head gardener was honor-bound to engage in a foot race with the condemned man through the palace gardens, covering roughly 300 meters to the execution site near the fish market gate. If the vizier could outrun the executioner, his sentence would be reduced from death to exile. If not, the race ended in a much bloodier finish. The origins of this deadly sprint remain unclear, but some believe it may have started when desperate viziers instinctively bolted upon seeing the red sherbet, and the tradition stuck. The last known person to win this life-or-death race was Grand Vizier Hakia Sahil Pasha in November 1822. Number 6. Falaka. The falaka was a ruthless method of corporal punishment used extensively in the Ottoman Empire, particularly to discipline soldiers, slaves, prisoners, and even schoolchildren. Unlike other brutal punishments that left visible scars or permanent injuries, the falaka focused on inflicting intense, lasting pain without any outward signs of torture, making it a preferred method for authorities seeking to maintain strict control without raising too many questions. This punishment involved binding the victim's feet together and suspending them in the air or securing them on a bench. The soles, one of the most nerve-sensitive areas of the body, were then repeatedly struck with a thick wooden rod, cane, or metal-reinforced stick. The pain was excruciating, often described as a sensation of burning, stabbing, and crushing all at once. Victims frequently howled in agony, and in severe cases they would lose consciousness, suffer nerve damage, or even experience long-term mobility issues. The number of strikes depended on the severity of the offense, with minor infractions earning a few blows and serious disobedience resulting in dozens, or even hundreds, of strikes. Some records suggest that victims subjected to the most extreme beatings could be crippled for life. Because the feet would swell, bruise, and sometimes bleed internally, victims often couldn't walk for days or even weeks. Beyond mere punishment, falaka was a psychological weapon. It was often carried out in public, in military camps, schools, and town squares, serving as a terrifying warning to others. In schools, rebellious students were forced to remove their shoes and socks before being punished in front of their classmates. In the military, officers used it to enforce absolute obedience, and in prisons, it was a favored method of torture and coercion. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. In the town of Eldormir, rules were sacred, and breaking them had dire consequences. When Mira defied an unjust law, she was dragged to the village square. Stripped of dignity, her hands and feet were bound, her stomach pressed against a wooden plank. The air was thick with silence as the whip cracked against her skin. Each lash wasn't just pain, it was a lesson burned into the minds of the onlookers. The elders watched with cold eyes, ensuring fear ruled their land. But as Mira's blood stained the wood, a spark ignited in the crowd. Whispers of rebellion spread. She wasn't just a criminal, she was a symbol. Could Mira's sacrifice ignite a revolution that would change Eldermere forever? Let us have your opinions in the comment below. Number 5. Sack drowning. Back in the 17th century, one of the most horrifying execution methods for women in the Ottoman Empire was sack drowning, being sewn into heavy, weighted sacks and thrown into the sea. This gruesome practice was often reserved for women accused of infidelity or for concubines who had fallen out of favor with the Sultan. One of the most infamous cases of this happened under the rule of Sultan Ibrahim I, also known as Ibrahim the Mad. His reign was marked by erratic behavior, paranoia, and extreme cruelty. According to historical accounts, Ibrahim ordered the mass execution of his entire imperial harem, 280 women, by having them stuffed into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus Strait. Some say this was because he suspected one of them had been unfaithful, while others believe he simply wanted to clear the palace for a new selection of concubines. His unpredictable and violent tendencies had already earned him a notorious reputation, but this act cemented his legacy as one of the most ruthless rulers in Ottoman history. However, something extraordinary happened. One woman is said to have survived. She was reportedly rescued by a passing French ship, and her story became an international sensation. When she arrived in Europe, her first-hand account of the horrors within the Sultan's palace made headlines, sparking both outrage and fascination. At the time, Europeans were already interested in the mysteries of the Ottoman harem, and her dramatic escape only fueled their curiosity. Her tale was published in newspapers and even inspired Western literature, shaping exoticized views of the Ottoman Empire for years to come. Number 4. Amputation. Back in the day, if someone was caught stealing or rebelling against authority, the punishment could be brutal, far worse than a simple fine or a stint in prison. Amputation, especially of the hands or feet, was a common penalty in many ancient and medieval societies, including the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic caliphates, and even some European and Asian cultures. The idea wasn't just to physically stop criminals from reoffending, but to make an unforgettable example out of them. These punishments were carried out in highly public places, bustling markets, grand city squares, or even in front of mosques, where crowds would gather to witness the spectacle. The executioner, often a skilled professional, used sharp blades or axes to sever the limb in a single, swift motion. Sometimes heated metal was pressed against the wound to cauterize it and prevent fatal blood loss, though many still suffered deadly infections. The sight of a person writhing in pain, missing a hand or foot, left an indelible mark on bystanders, reinforcing the idea that crime simply didn't pay. In the Ottoman judicial system, where Islamic law played a major role, amputation was reserved for severe crimes like repeated theft, desertion, or treason. However, it wasn't applied recklessly. Judges required solid evidence, often multiple witnesses, before sentencing someone to such a fate. Despite its brutality, many rulers saw this as a necessary measure to maintain strict social order and protect property. Today, people might see such punishments as extreme, but in those times, they were viewed as an effective way to deter crime and instill fear in potential lawbreakers. Number 3. Sawing. During the Ottoman Empire, one of the most terrifying and seldom used methods of execution was testere ile kesme, which translates to cutting with a saw. Unlike other executions that were brutal but relatively swift, this method was designed to maximize suffering. The condemned was sawed apart while still alive, often in front of a crowd, ensuring a slow and agonizing death that served as a gruesome warning to others. The method itself was nightmarish. Executioners could see the victim vertically, starting from the head and working down through the torso, or horizontally, slicing through the waist. Some accounts even suggest that in certain cases, the victim was hung upside down, allowing gravity to make the process even more painful as blood rushed to the head, prolonging consciousness and suffering. The saws used weren't always sharp either. Duller blades meant the execution took longer, making it even more excruciating. Because of its sheer horror, this punishment was only reserved for the most severe crimes, like treason, high betrayal, or sacrilegious acts that deeply offended the empire and its rulers. But it wasn't just about punishment. It was psychological warfare. These executions were often staged in public places, like bustling marketplaces or city squares, where hundreds or even thousands of people would gather to witness the horrifying spectacle. The empire wanted people to remember what happened to those who defied its rule, ensuring that fear alone would keep them in line. Despite the Ottoman Empire's reputation for harsh justice, this method was considered too extreme and was used very rarely. Number 2. Impalement. The Ottoman Empire had many brutal execution methods, but one of the most horrifying and infamous was impalement. This gruesome punishment involved driving a long, sharpened stake through a person's body, often starting from the lower end and exiting through the chest, back, or even the mouth. This method was especially terrifying because it wasn't just painful, it was agonizingly slow. If done with precision, the stake could be carefully inserted to avoid hitting vital organs, prolonging the victim's suffering for hours or even days before they finally died from shock, blood loss, or infection. Some historical accounts suggest that victims could remain alive for up to 3 days, their bodies writhing in unimaginable agony while onlookers were forced to watch as a grim warning. Impalement was usually reserved for the worst offenders, traitors, rebels, or those who committed particularly horrific crimes such as murder, treason, or espionage. However, it wasn't just about punishment. It was also a psychological weapon designed to instill terror. The Ottomans, like other great empires of the time, understood that fear was an effective tool for maintaining control. Public impalements were often carried out in busy squares or along roads leading into rebellious regions, ensuring that travelers and locals alike would see the gruesome spectacle and think twice before defying Ottoman rule. Many people associate impalement with Vlad the Impaler, the 15th century Wallachian ruler who famously used it against both criminals and invading Ottoman forces. Vlad's preferred method was said to be so refined that he could control how long a person suffered, sometimes adjusting the stake's angle to ensure a slow, excruciating death. Number 1. Boiling in a cauldron. Back in the brutal days of the Ottoman Empire, one of the most terrifying execution methods was kazan kaynatma, meaning boiling the cauldron. This horrifying punishment was reserved for the worst criminals, traitors, spies, and palace officials accused of poisoning, a crime that could shake the very foundation of the empire. In an era where rulers lived in constant fear of betrayal, such extreme measures were seen as necessary to maintain absolute control. The condemned was not simply thrown into a cauldron. Executioners often made the process as agonizing as possible. The victim would be slowly lowered into a massive iron pot filled with either scalding water or, even worse, bubbling oil. While boiling water caused unbearable pain, it was nothing compared to oil, which could reach over 300 Fahrenheit and cause third-degree burns within seconds. Some reports suggest that to prolong the suffering, executioners would dip the victim inch by inch, ensuring they experienced the full horror of being cooked alive before losing consciousness from shock. These brutal executions were not hidden from the public. Instead, they were carried out in palace courtyards, military camps, or even bustling city squares, turning them into gruesome spectacles. Crowds gathered to watch, as the sight and smell of burning flesh served as a stark warning to anyone considering treason. This method was particularly feared by palace cooks, as even a suspicion of attempted poisoning could lead them straight to the cauldron. The role of the royal food taster was one of the most dangerous jobs in the empire, as a single mistake could cost them their life. What are your thoughts about these terrifying and brutal punishment methods that were once used in the Ottoman Empire? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below.